Let's talk about sex differences in sex drive between men and women. This is one of the most misunderstood issues with regards to sexuality, and that's a problem because when we don't understand something, we then make up stories about it that are not helpful. So here's the thing. Men have a higher sex drive than women in general. Now, that doesn't mean every man has a higher sex drive than every woman, but in general, men have higher drives. And let's talk about that. Do you know that there isn't one piece of research I'm aware of that demonstrates otherwise? Isn't that astounding? Because if you go online and you start to read about sex differences in sex drive, what will you hear? You're going to hear that whole concept be minimized. You're going to hear people saying, well, there's more differences within the sexes than between them, and whatever else you're going to hear about.
Before we start, a small disclaimer. The Sex Doctors podcast is not a substitute for medical or psychological advice.
But I know of no piece of research that suggests that women have even an equivalent sex drive. Now, I do know a couple of authors who have done research found that in their sample, men had a higher drive, but they'll still say, we think this isn't accurate. And then what happens is that research gets quoted. And so it sort of supports this notion that there's an equivalent sex drive between the sexes or whatever else. This is important, I think, because desire discrepancies in heterosexual couples are super common, but you can't solve a problem you don't understand. So let's lay this out so that you can understand it. First of all, the reason this is so confusing to so many people is it's really only evident in long-term relationships. So people don't see this kind of distinction between men and women in sex drive in short-term relationships or in hookups or whatever else. So this only manifests in long-term relationships. What does that mean? That means every woman in a long-term relationship has been in a short-term relationship, and she may well have had a higher drive than her partner at the beginning of that relationship or in a short-term relationship, whatever. So she's had that experience of having a higher drive than a man. And her tendency then is to think that that's who she is. That's her normal sex drive. And so then she gets confused when she's in a longer-term relationship and her drive isn't the same. She thinks, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with my partner? She starts to create stories about what's going on because it's not her baseline experience. Her original experience was that her drive was the same or more. It's also important for people to understand this because what happens for a woman in a long-term relationship is if she then leaves that relationship, let's say she gets a divorce, she goes back on the dating scene, her sex drive is back. Well, that's fabulous. But she might think, well, it's because, something was wrong with my last relationship. And that very well may be something was wrong with the last relationship. However, we can expect her sex drive to come back simply because she's back in short-term relationships again. And this is also what happens when people have affairs. So a woman's in a long-term relationship. Her sex drive isn't what she wants it to be. She has an affair. That's a short-term relationship. Even if it's a long-term affair, that's a short-term relationship. Her sex drive comes back. And so she thinks that that's proof that, she's with the right partner or whatever. Now, maybe she's with the right partner, but the return of her sex drive is simply proof that women have a higher drive in a short-term relationship than a long-term relationship. So why is that? People often say it's socialization, that women have a lower drive than men. And of course, that's true in some circumstances more than others. So since that's been discussed so much, I'm not going to spend time in this video on the socialization piece. I'm going to talk to you about 3 other reasons why women have a lower desire than men in long-term relationships. Okay? One of them is it's explained by what's called the dual control model of sexual desire. This was developed by Kinsey researchers some years ago, and it's still being researched today. And it's a very basic model of low desire, but it's very helpful in understanding sexual desire. Okay. And basically what it is sort of like a scale. And we all have on one side of the scale things that excite us. That's called excitatory stimuli. Okay. So what excites us? People have different things. So some people like porn. Some people like romantic dinners with their partner. Some people like reading erotica. Some people like, whatever else. Everybody's got different excitatory factors, excitatory stimulation. And then everybody has what's called inhibitory stimulation, inhibitory factors. So that's just, as it sounds, things that make us not want to have sex. And of course, that's different for everyone still. So inhibitory factors are you got in a fight with your partner. You had a hard day at work. You had too much dinner and you're just not feeling great. So everybody's got those too. But here's the thing. Women in general have more inhibitory factors than men, and they have fewer excitatory factors than men. And so on the scale, with this balance, what happens is women have more of these, less of these. Guys, on the other hand, have the opposite. They have fewer inhibitory factors and more excitatory factors. So that right there means their libido is going to be generally higher. Now, this kind of balance doesn't play out as much in the beginning of a relationship because lust is so high and there are other elements that really feed passion at the beginning of a relationship. So this sort of scale of inhibition and excitation plays out more in long-term relationships. I hear it all the time in my treatment room. Women will say things like, she doesn't want to have sex when the kids are nearby. That's understandable. That interferes with her ability to let go. She'll say that she is too exhausted to have sex. She'll say that she feels like her medical problems and her emotional problems interfere with her ability to want sex, whatever. I mean, there's a long list, and it's totally understandable. This isn't to say that any of that is wrong. Of course, those are reasons she doesn't want to have sex, but men don't have those long lists. They just don't. So a man might say, I'm too stressed to have sex, but they're not going to say generally, I don't think I've ever heard a man say, I can't have sex if the kids are in the house. You see? So men have some inhibitory factors, but not the same number as women do. So that's one of these reasons why in a long-term relationship, men have higher desire than women. But that's just one. There's another issue too, and that is that in a long-term relationship, everybody reports things are a little less exciting than they used to be. That's just sort of typical, and we've talked about that in other videos. But so as a relationship ages, everybody says, yeah, my partner's just a little less exciting than they used to be. People get used to their partner. They get used to what they do with their partner. It's just a little less exciting. However, when you ask a man, in a heterosexual relationship, are you less excited by your partner? They'll say, yeah. And then you say, well, does that interfere with your ability with your wanting sex with her? No, I still want sex with her. Whereas you ask a woman, are you a little less attracted to your partner over time? She'll say, yeah. And then you ask her, well, does that interfere with your ability to want sex with him? Yeah. So for women, and we have lots of research supporting this, for women, that decrease in lust as a relationship ages has a much bigger impact for her than it does a typical man. And finally, there's a reaction that can play out in long-term relationships of disgust. Okay, we call it a disgust response. And in general, women have a higher disgust response than men. So we understand that to be evolutionarily based, meaning that because women get pregnant and they breastfeed, the more toxin they might ingest, the less likely their baby's going to survive. And so the more they have a reaction of disgust, the less chance they're going to, eat or somehow interact with something toxic. So their disgust response is higher. But that plays out in sex too. So what that means is, in general, women find more things disgusting than men. And this plays out in the general population too. I have many more men saying to me, I want to have anal sex with my wife than I have women saying, I want my husband to have anal sex with me. Now, I do hear that, of course, but it's not the same level. And so what will women say when they don't want anal sex? They'll say it's disgusting. So at any rate, so women have a higher disgust response. But here's the thing. At the beginning of a relationship, that disgust response is, it's trumped by lust. So, at the beginning of a relationship, the lust factor is highest. That's when people feel the most lusty in their partnership. So if her disgust response is generally here, but in the beginning of a relationship, her lust response, her feelings of lust is up here, then she's generally willing to do stuff that she might otherwise say is gross. Okay, so let's say it's anal sex or oral sex. I hear this all the time about oral sex. I'll hear a woman say, I used to like receiving oral sex from my partner. I don't like receiving oral sex anymore. I hear that a lot. I have never heard that from a man. I've never heard a man say, I used to like it when my partner went down on me. I don't like it anymore. So this is why. So at the beginning of a relationship, her lust response is high and her disgust response is here. But as a relationship ages and her lust response starts to diminish, as it does in a longer-term relationship, she's more aware of her disgust response. So stuff that used to be within the realm of possible for her no longer feels possible. And guys don't show that kind of distinction in a long-term relationship. Their disgust response is generally lower and their lust response is generally higher. And so they never sort of feel that shift over time. So that's why in a longer-term relationship, we hear women saying that their sex drive is lower than men. And again, we have so much research supporting this. And these are the reasons why that occurs. Now, that doesn't mean that couples are out of luck, that if her desire is lower than his, then they're stuck. They're not at all stuck. There's so much you can do. But really, until couples understand what the dynamics are that lead to her lower desire, it's going to be difficult to find workarounds. Workarounds absolutely exist. Absolutely. But if a couple doesn't understand what is playing out, it's much more difficult to do that. And, I often end talking about sex tech, and I'm going to say that again, that we all have to become more educated about sex and better lovers. We have to be better lovers because sex tech is getting more and more advanced, and we want to use sex tech for good, right? To enhance intimate relationships. But if we don't understand our intimate relationships and we're not interacting in a very positive way, it's going to be much more difficult to maintain those intimate relationships in a healthy way, at least as sex tech gets more and more advanced. So there you have it. That's why men show a higher libido in long-term relationships than women.